welcome to DEIJB Conversations. I'm Reverend Jackie Fernandez, and today we will be talking about advocacy and power, also rolling in the concept of intersectionality. So the title for today's presentation is Meet Me at the Intersection, Advocacy and Power. We will also be talking about how advocacy and power intersect and relating all of this to the work of ministry and to the context of ministry. So I'll have some very specific practices and opportunities for reflection in the work of ministry around this topic. But first, let's define our terms. So, what is intersectionality? It is coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it recognizes overlapping systems of discrimination. It is not additive, but is multiplicative. So, examples include Black women. So, you have the intersection of womanhood and Blackness, disabled queer youth. So you have a young person who is queer and disabled. So it's levels of marginalization or demographics that are often discriminated against, sort of piled upon each other. So then you have undocumented Latinx families. Again, you have that there are documented Latinx families, so you have that marginalization, the opportunities for discrimination. And really, when Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, she meant it for legal context. So what I'd like to do is share a TikTok that is from the TED Talks user name. So I have on the side of the slide where you can find it, and there's a link there in case for any of the reason the video doesn't travel with the PowerPoint and you want to watch it later or on your own. So you'll see a gentleman here, and he's kind of emceeing the video. He'll be at the beginning and at the end, but otherwise it'll be a clip of Kimberly Crenshaw's actual TED Talk. So let me play that for us now.
What do you call the combination of racism and sexism?
Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice.
Kimberly Crenshaw came up with the term after learning about a court case involving a Black woman unsuccessfully suing a business on the grounds of sexism and racism. Basically, when the company hired Black people, they were only men for maintenance jobs, and when they hired women, they were only for secretary jobs, but only white women. So as a Black woman, she was stuck at this intersection between racism and sexism.
Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law is like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersect.
Intersectionality isn't just reserved for those two facets. It applies to intersections of race, gender, heterosexism, xenophobia, transphobia, ableism, and much more. So as the U.S. moves from Black History Month to Women's History Month, it's important for all of us to keep doing the work to understand the complexities of social injustice.
All right, absolutely important for us to keep doing the work and to keep understanding and expanding our vocabulary because the words we use, the language we use have power and also reflect our skill set and our awareness. So intersectionality in ministry, congregants and leaders bring layered identities. We are people being people. And so we want to have this awareness. We risk invisibility for marginalized groups even within inclusive communities. So if we are only looking at, like the video showed, one road, for example, if we are only looking at gender, we are only looking at sexual orientation, or we're only looking at race, or we're only looking at abilities, then even though we are being inclusive, we might miss some of the nuances around the lived experiences of those who have intersectionality. So ministry practices can unintentionally reinforce dominant norms. And this is, the whole purpose of having this kind of training. And I believe for our requirements for CEUs is so that we can continue to dismantle the ways that we unintentionally reinforce dominant norms, that we can continue to bring awareness to the topic for us as leaders, and as well to bring it to our ministry leaders, our lay leaders within the ministry, so that we can really impact the culture of our spiritual centers, and for those who are doing ministry outside of spiritual centers in the work that you are doing. So let's dive a little deeper into intersectionality in ministry. People experience systems differently. So race, gender, sexuality, disability, class, age, immigration status, and faith identity. I would also include, things like, well, it says class. I was going to say, inclusive of class are things like access to healthcare, access to food security. So to really sort of pull those out so that we're not just generally speaking of, the rich and the poor, but the nuances within even those groups. All of that intersect to shape how individuals encounter both opportunity and oppression. And we can carry privilege in one way and marginalization in another way. And so that's where it's really important for us to be able to understand the nuances so that we can connect more fully and more deeply with each other. So one size fits all advocacy often leaves people behind. Effective ministry leadership asks this question: who is not being served by this solution? And pays attention to those living at multiple intersections of marginalization. So being in that question of who are we missing? Who is not being served? If we are having a food pantry and, you have to drive yourself to get the food, we might be missing people who lack transportation. For example, if we are offering a food pantry, but it is in a neighborhood, located in a neighborhood that is not safe for people of color to be in, or for undocumented people to be in, then we might be missing a solution. So there could be an opportunity to take the food to the communities who most need it. So those are just some quick off-the-cuff examples of how it might apply to ministry activity to really help ground this. We want to listen closest to the impact. Those who are most affected by policies or practices or cultural norms that we have often have the clearest insight into what needs to change. And to not receive that information as complaining. We get a lot of feedback in the work of ministry, and it can become easy to build up sort of a thick skin and to dismiss certain people who might be, complaining or, habitually complaining. But it can serve us well to really look at that and to really see with a like to really step back and see with a broader lens of what might be the source of the complaints. Is there something in the system of the spiritual community or the work that we are doing, the community we have created, that is causing continued pain in this person, continued marginalization, continued exclusion, and the best way that they know how to speak to it, and you may not be skillful, it may just be through, constant complaining. So to really be able to take a look at it without defensiveness, and but really through this lens of what might be missed in the ways that we are practicing and carrying out our activities, our ministry activities. Moving beyond representation to transformation. So inclusion is not just about inviting diverse people into existing structures. It's not about, how can we, get more people of color in our community so we can say that we are diverse, or more deaf folks, or more, people who, are from the other side of town, whether that's the wealthy side or the poor side. It's not just about that, but it's about examining whether the structures themselves are creating barriers. Are people able to get transportation? Is there public transportation available? Do you have a ministry team that volunteers to give rides to those who are unable to drive, whether it's because they're elderly or because of their abilities or their PTSD or whatever reason they're unable to drive themselves to your facility, but they want to attend? What are the barriers that exist? Not to say you're going to be able to meet the needs and break down every barrier, but having awareness is the first step to making that assessment and prioritizing what barriers you will address and in what order and to what degree. If we don't look at it, then they just all stay there and we stay in this sort of, you know, state of separation without intending it. So, intersectionality is a spiritual practice of seeing whole people. It's a spiritual practice of understanding that the layers of identity impact people's experiences and who they are and how they are able to or not able to move in the world. So, advocacy rooted in compassion recognizes that no one experiences life through a single identity, and that human dignity is strengthened when all dimensions of a person's experience are honored. I just love that last part. Human dignity is strengthened when all dimensions of a person's experience are honored. So when we want to do the work of advocacy, we want to anchor it in that kind of compassion that we bring our unity principles, we bring, that spirit of seeing and knowing the wholeness in all people, but also recognizing that the lived experience can break down that sense of wholeness based on the layers of identity, the communities that people are living in, the structures, the laws of the time and day that they are living in, and also the history that they're bringing forward and the baggage packed from that history. So we want to keep compassion as part of this work. So let's go more into power and privilege. Our definitions of power are the ability to influence outcomes or access resources. If you are able to influence the outcome of anything or access resources, you have power, you carry power. Privilege is about unearned benefits and resources given to dominant groups. So if you are able to gain resources and benefits because you are part of a dominant group, that is the privilege you carry. So we want to be aware of our personal power and privilege as well as our institutional power and privilege, from the church perspective, if you are in a church ministry. But also, from spiritual and religious perspective, um, carries a lot of power and privilege, especially with our Christian roots in this particular country, the United States. It naturally carries power and privilege. So we want to be really clear and aware of our personal power and privilege as ministers, as spiritual leaders, and also through the intersectionalities that we may carry with us in that in our personal lives, as well as what is happening in our institutions. So here's an opportunity to power map in ministry. And this is, just an example, and the ranks or rates sort of might be different in your community. So if you're looking at the senior minister, there may not be a senior minister in your spiritual community. But traditionally speaking, we'll just kind of work with a traditional context and environment of a center. Formal power is high for the senior minister. Informal power is also high, and influence on culture is very high. The senior minister tends to be the face of a ministry, tends to be involved in most decisions that are made around the ministry. There's also the projection of, what the congregation puts onto the senior minister in terms of spiritual authority. That's, speaks to more of the informal power. We know that we don't have any more sort of power with God than anyone else does, but there is certainly the projection of that. And how we move and act, how we speak, what topics we bring forward absolutely influences the culture of our communities. The board chair has high formal power. They have medium informal power, and then they have high influence on culture because they are also leading the group of people who are making policy, who are, vouching for the cultural vibe that the senior minister wants to set and supporting that. So there's going to be a high influence on culture. The level of transparency and integrity that the board chair operates with is going to influence the culture. So there's a very high impact there. Your music director, formal power medium, they report up. Informal power high. That is because music, makes or breaks an experience. It opens hearts, and we probably, if you have the same experience I have, would be the highest or the most frequent place where comments and feedback are given are relevant to the music, good or bad comments. So there's informal power is high, and influence on culture absolutely high. What kind of music is coming forward? What kind of how is the music delivered by instrumentation? Do you have a band? Do you have a piano player? Do you have an organ player? Who the soloists are? Is it the music director, the same person week after week, or are they bringing guests in? Either way, it's also something that is, experienced, becomes sort of the face of the ministry, at least of the Sunday experience for church ministry. So very high influence on culture. Prayer chaplains, and this is one that it may vary in your community, especially if you're in a community that doesn't have a spiritual leader, or just basically, depending on how you position the prayer team in your ministry. Formal power is probably medium to low. Informal power, medium, and influence on culture, medium. They should be a steady presence, and offering that prayerful space and holding the prayer conscience. And with that consciousness, and with that, you could say, well, therefore, they have a high influence on culture, because they are praying with folks, and we know the power of prayer. So that one, I hold loosely the ratings on that, and think that it highly varies from community to community. New members have low formal power. They have low informal power and low to medium influence on culture. If the new members coming in are very different than the existing members, that's going to probably have a bigger influence on culture than if it's more of the same kind of people that really going to come in and fold in and not really change the culture at all. So there can be a variation there. Longtime congregants, on the other hand, can have high, medium, or low formal power, again, depending on the structure of your community, on the participation level of active members, through annual meeting voting, through committees, through those kinds of activities, how many lay leaders you have in the community, how many longtime congregants. If you only have a few, there might not be very much formal power. If you have a lot of longtime members, like I have at Unity Church of Overland Park, the formal power is pretty high. And the informal power can be very high, because they will often set the tone of the culture. And, they also carry the memories of the community and the history of the community with them. And their influence on culture, again, depending on I guess, percentage of your population, could be medium or high. And that goes hand in hand with that informal power. So this is a really good sort of map to use, and you might add different kinds of, you might even really get down into the different committees. It might include, YFM leaders. There's, a lot more places you can take this. Hold on, let me go back to that. In order to really just evaluate, and really this is just informative. This is to give you an idea of where, if there's something in the system that you're identifying as a point of breakdown, this can help you find solutions in the most efficient way. It can also kind of tell you who you need to get buy-in from for a change that maybe needs to be made. So this can be a very simple but very effective and powerful tool to really do the power mapping. So here's another perspective, same task of power mapping in your ministry, but going through the type of power, which there are 4 types of power listed here: positional power, collective power, personal power, and spiritual power. And so then going through how the church, through church expression, how are these powers fulfilled or expressed? Where are the opportunities of advocacy within um, these experiences, and then what is, the intersectional relation. So let's go through that. So the type of power, positional power, and the answers again may shift depending on the culture of your spiritual community and whether it's a church center, or whether it's more of an alternative ministry, but still worth doing the work. If you are working with people, you are working with the dynamics of power. So positional power. In church expression, you have the board, the senior minister, and executive staff. Those are positional power expressions. And then the opportunities for advocacy are through setting policy, approving budgets. If you want to know somebody's values, look at their budget. And that's true personally, and it's true institutionally. The hiring decisions, opportunities for advocacy and hiring decisions, that again, who is hired is going to impact that positional power. And then setting DEIJB priorities, that's where it's going to come from. It's probably not going to come from the congregation or any affinity group. It's going to come from those with positional power. So then, if we want to look at intersectional questions, who typically holds these roles? And are they diverse? When you look at your board, your senior minister, and your executive staff, what degrees of diversity are there? Are there voices at that positional power decision-making table that are diverse, or are they more homogenous? And, again, we don't want to go right to tokenism and just start pulling, someone of color or someone who's disabled, or any of that kind of behavior or response. We want to be able to be aware so that then we know when we're in the process of making a decision, perhaps we need to have conversations outside of this group with people who are being impacted personally by the kind of policy that we are setting, by the kind of budget decisions that we are making, the kind of hiring decisions we are making. If you look and you see all white board, all white, senior minister and executive staff, you might go to the people of color in your congregation and have conversations about that. What keeps you here? If it's a Black person, there's Sundays remain the most segregated day of the week in the United States. Martin Luther King said that, you know, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And is still true today. So why are people of color coming to your church and not going to a traditionally Black church? What is it? Asking those kinds of questions can help inform how are we going to now be able to cultivate, why is your Black community in your congregation not stepping into board service? Is there a gap in that sort of escalation of leadership? Are they, is your prayer chaplain team or whatever your funnel of leadership or ladder of leadership service is often people come into prayer chaplain team and then go into board service, for example. Where is the breakdown happening, and why are people of color not being invited into that leadership funnel, so to speak? So again, it's a way of gathering information so that you can become aware and illuminate those more nuanced barriers that maybe you're not aware of. So then there's collective power. We hold collective power in the congregation through ministry teams, through affinity groups, through voting members, so the active members in your community. That's collective power, where people as a group get to come together and gather their influence and their power. And so the opportunities for advocacy there are to influence culture, to shift norms, to propose initiatives, accountability for leadership. So it's a really good, it's collective power can be leveraged to support the expression of mission and vision and values of your community. It's a really important way. And if there is a disconnect between those with positional power and those with collective power, then that's where we can come into a lot of conflict in our communities. So really being able to understand how power is at work in our communities can help us understand how to create solutions that really truly work for all, and that will be efficient and effective and with compassion, honoring our spiritual principles. So then intersectional questions would be whose concerns get traction? Is there an affinity group or a ministry team maybe who's had the same members for, you know, 15 years that is really, overpowering the collective opinion about any one thing? This is where we want to start seeing who's using their collective power to actually make things happen. Whose concerns are getting traction? Who feels safe to speak? Does everyone feel safe to speak? Does everyone feel comfortable saying, hey, this really doesn't work for me. We have flashing lights at the beginning of service, and I, have epilepsy, or it brings up PTSD for me. I'm dizzy, or I'm neurodivergent. Are people able and safe, feeling safe to be able to speak to their needs in a way that then there's an opportunity for both those with collective power and those with positional power to support them and to try to address and meet the needs. Of course, we can't, meet every single preference, but when it comes to back to our ideas of accessibility and, what equality, what are those experiences, belongingness, all of our DEIJB, we want to be sure that we aren't just serving the dominant group. So then let's go to personal power. In church expression, personal power is expressed through lay leaders, through prayer chaplains, through music team, through longtime members. And the opportunities for advocacy are that, when the individuals can model inclusive language, that becomes advocacy. So if a newcomer comes in and the greeter greets them at the door and says, my name, is Joan and my pronouns are she, her, that immediately models inclusive language and gives permission for the first time visitor to understand that one, this is an inclusive community and a welcoming community, an embracing community who has done the work of gaining the competency of being inclusive. So it's not just lip service, there is, action behind that. Then they can feel safe to also offer their pronouns that may not, be assumed, may not match what one might assume for them. So that's an example of modeling inclusive language and leveraging that personal power to do so in an effective way. Mentoring others. Redirecting harm, see something, say something, or they, see someone, discriminating or, causing some kind of emotional or social harm, to someone, they're going to have the opportunity to step in and put a stop to it, and to elevate marginalized voices. And that personal power speaks to also those personal relationships and friendships, that people have within the community that maybe are not taking place through those teams and ministry teams, affinity groups, through collective power. It might just be a one-on-one conversation that it's like, oh, this person was using a walker and boy, it's really hard. This one door is very heavy and it's always closed. Is there any way we can keep it open because they have a hard time getting through that door with their walker and they lose balance? Or can we have someone stand by the door ready to help anyone who has a difficult time opening that door? So oftentimes those kinds of things will be revealed through those personal relationships, and they're able to, but they need to know that they have the power then to elevate those marginalized voices, which is why we have these conversations. So they might just think, oh, I'm so sorry that's hard for you, and then move on and not think, "Well, oh, actually, I have an opportunity here to create a solution or to ask. I know who to go to ask for a solution." So our lay leaders, our prayer chaplains, our music team, and our longtime members, with those groups we have, or with those individuals, we have an opportunity to inform them of their personal power, to ask them to model inclusive language because they have personal power in the context of ministry, and that becomes latent advocacy. They have opportunity to mentor others, to redirect harm, to elevate marginalized voices. Sometimes it's just as simple as we need to tell people about the power that they carry. They may not realize it. They may not it. If people aren't comfortable with their own relationship to personal power, spiritual authority, those kinds of things, then they aren't going to naturally think of it. So we have to tell them and then also give them the training to do so. So the intersectional questions that we would ask here are how do individual leaders use spiritual authority or relational capital to affect change? Do they realize that this is their opportunity to impact real change? In the collective power, something especially right now, it's Pride Month, telling your congregation who is probably majority heterosexual, telling them how important it is that they are the ones who create safe space for the queer community. It's not just that unity as a movement affirms the sacred worth of all beings. It's not just that the minister, in my case, who is queer, or any board members or those with positional power are members of the queer community or allies of the queer community, but it's really the entire congregation who does or doesn't create safe space for queer individuals to cross the threshold into the building. They may not be aware of that power. They may just see themselves as part of something that already affirms that. And so in a way, we embolden their personal power. We help them connect to their divine authority, to their spiritual authority, also to their relational capital. And so that now they're doing it with awareness. And so they're going to take more responsibility and ownership of how they are using that personal power. Sometimes, again, we just have to tell them, and oh, yeah, I can do that. I want to do that. They just don't realize it. So then, of course, there's spiritual power. And in church expression, that's through teachings, through the sacred texts that we use, through talk themes, affirmations and practices about prayer, and then mission and vision statements. All of those speak to the spiritual power that is alive within our communities. So the opportunities for advocacy here from the spiritual power is to deconstruct oppressive theology we do this a lot. Like I think the most common way that we do this is when we talk about metaphysical malpractice, right? That's a really good, solid example. But there are other ways that we can really deconstruct oppressive theology. I think it can be really important through our unity texts, because the Fillmores were white, Emily Cady, Eric Butterworth, but we have so many great leaders and great books that have been written by people of color, and to let those voices also speak into the unity experience and how our unity principles are taught. We can amplify liberation-based teachings. And we can affirm dignity for all. So those are the opportunities, is to really be clear and direct about how our spiritual teachings are liberation based. So then the intersectional questions are whose theologies are centered or marginalized in teaching, preaching, and prayer? What voices are being represented and which are being kept on the margin? What is normalized as universal truth? What is normalized as universal truth? Such an important question. Because if it's universal truth, then it applies to everyone. And are we able and willing to directly address our, principles on healing to people who are sitting in the room in a wheelchair or with a chronic illness or with mental health challenges, who are people who are deaf, who don't necessarily identify as being disabled? Deaf culture is a proud culture that celebrates deafness. So what is the language that we're using specific to universal truth, health, and wholeness in light of all of these lived experiences? And how are we teaching those? Really important questions to ask and reflections, and that will change and grow with us and with our experience. And also, I think by being in the reflection of these questions will compel us to have more conversations with more people and representatives from different types of groups. So it can help us to expand not only our social circles, but our mentor circles and those who we are in conversation with about these topics. So again, this is very simple power mapping, simple, but maybe not easy. And also in some ways might feel a little, especially this part, feel a little complex. But opportunity here to really go through and just see there may be a difference between what you want the answers to be and what they actually are within your communities. And then that becomes opportunity for conversation with you as a minister and your board, with your ministry leaders, and opportunity for training and education. So here's some other questions for reflection. Where do you hold power in your ministry? Who is left out of decision making? How might intersectionality inform pastoral care? And what is one small shift you can make toward equity? I always emphasize those small shifts because sometimes we can start to feel overwhelmed. You might look at some of this power mapping and feel like, oh my gosh, well, we're a mess. We've got, one group that's, acting as bullies in the community and really hoarding power. And then we've got, a group of enablers who are supporting them, but actually don't agree with what they're doing. We see all of these, family systems, people dynamics, both toxic and healthy in our communities. And sometimes it can be overwhelming to like, look, I'm just trying to get through Sunday. I'm just trying to get through the next pastoral care meeting, with this person, or I'm trying to, work things through with my board and we're having issues or with, our ministry leaders or our prayer team is, whatever it is. Ministry itself can be so overwhelming. We carry a lot and we are uniquely qualified and skilled and called to this work. And I think it is so important that we also give ourselves permission that sometimes it's just the small shift and that can have a great impact and to trust that part of the process. So that instead of sort of going into overwhelm and shutting down and like, well, I'm just going to deal with that another time, or I can't right now, and then it keeps getting kicked down the road. What is just one small shift you can make now toward equity? Just let it be a small thing. Is it a phone call? Is it a conversation? Is it a question that you might ask? Is it adding a topic to your board agenda? Is it, creating a class around something specific around advocacy or power or diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and belonging? And maybe not even the class that's going to go right now, but where it's a workshop, something in the future. But what's one small shift that you can make toward equity? And is it a personal shift? Is it an institutional shift? Tools for equity in ministry, rotating leadership roles, making sure that it's not the same people who are staying in leadership, that there is opportunity, that is what creates the expression of diversity, that there's opportunity for people to rotate into leadership role. And then you have a deep bench of leaders, so to speak, within your ministry. And then, those people are the ones who are also, because they're more involved, who are also probably more in tune with the spiritual principles and making, you know, putting into practice their spiritual principles as well. So that shifts the consciousness of your community. Transparent communication about decision making is a huge tool for equity because it allows people then to know what is happening behind the scenes. They feel less pushed to the margin, and they then become aware of when are there opportunities for them to speak into something. Well, I had no idea the board was even talking about building a new ramp, on the front door. I would have told them, actually, all of the handicap parking spots are closer to the side door. And so that's the place to build the ramp. If we aren't bringing those who are most affected into the conversation and to the table of decision making, it's going to be easier for us to make a miss. And when it comes to something like that, comes with a financial investment, it can be difficult once it's done to roll it back and do it over. So better for us to, operate with transparent communication and rotating leadership roles. And then to have story circles from time to time to share diverse experiences. Holidays are a great time for this. Thanksgiving, it can be a great time for story circles, to have a meal or, to have, small group meals to where people are tied together. We did this on our Good Friday service, where we kept people at tables and guided them through some deeper conversations. They really got to know each other in ways that they wouldn't perhaps on Sunday or even in other small groups. Um, and then accessible worship spaces and programming, being sure that we are always working to improve the accessibility, whether that's, adding a hybrid option, so that those who can't come physically to the space are able to attend, whether it's about the lighting, about the technology, whatever it is, to really be sure, again, it can take place in small shifts. We don't have to overhaul things in the midst of everything else we are trying to accomplish in ministry. Acknowledge and address harm when it occurs. Like really, giving place and space for people to be heard, to honestly express their experiences, and for it to be addressed, compassionately, of course, honestly, of course, and, with our values always at the forefront. But, to not just try to sweep it under the rug or just apologize. We didn't mean for that to happen, but to really address it and to look at, is there something in the system? Or is there something, in the physical space? Is there something in the culture? Is there something in policy that can be improved to prevent that kind of harm that has been expressed? We cannot heal what we do not acknowledge. May we lead with love, listen with humility, and dismantle with courage. Let this be a mantra. We cannot heal what we do not acknowledge. So turning away from it is not going to get us anywhere. And we don't have to, be lost in the overwhelm of more work to do. But, and justice work itself is a marathon and it can be exhausting. And so to know that it's okay to tap out for a time and, re-energize and reinvigorate yourself, re-inspire yourself, and then come back into it. And it's okay to acknowledge, hey, I need a break, and to come in fresh, and continue to lead with love, continue to listen with humility, and to continue to dismantle with courage because it takes courage. It's not easy work. Our congregants, people in our communities have been through so much, and these times take a lot of courage. And if we continue to let love lead, then we will find our way and we will find our way together doing this important work. So I thank you for your courage. I thank you for your humility. And I thank you for your willingness to let love lead. And, I'm in this work with you and available if you have any questions or you want to talk through anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. I will show you this last slide with my contact information. Of course, if you're friends on Facebook, you can always message me. You can get our email phone number from the church website. We will have our reflection session. So this session is recorded. If you aren't with us, you can always listen to it anytime and join us for the reflection session on Thursday, June 25th at 11 a.m. Central Time. If you are listening and have an opportunity to, I always like to assign a little bit of homework. It is not graded, it is not evaluated unless you bring it and want it to be up for discussion. Sometimes we just work through it together during the reflection session. But to complete the power map, exercise for your spiritual community. This PowerPoint will be on the USCR website along with the recording. And so you can go to those slides and or take a screenshot, take a picture with your device, however you want to do it, and do that power map exercise for your spiritual community and see what comes up for you. See what is revealed and how your spirit might move in you for this work. Then in July, on the second Thursday, July 9th, I will be talking about privilege. Ain't no privilege like the one I've got. It's always our favorite privilege to carry. And with some focus on interdependence, it'll be right after Independence Day and of course, our 250th anniversary as a nation. So I'll bring some of that in, even though it will have already passed. There is always interdependence happening for us and never the wrong time to talk about that. So thank you, thank you, thank you for your commitment to this work and bless you in all that you are doing.